Good evening. Thank you very much for coming to join us and spend your Saturday evening with us. Hi. So, we're here tonight with Marcus Gibbs, one of our lovely guests of honour. Marcus started his career as a bookseller and then became an editor. Very quickly became someone to watch in the publishing industry. He has worked with many well-known and renowned authors. Currently creates the SF Masterworks list. And he's very excited to speak to you.
Oh, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. This is very nice.
So, how about if you start off by telling us a bit about how you first got into publishing?
Sure. So out of university, I went and worked in a bookshop because I had a few months to kill, and I'd always worked in bookshops during summer holidays and so on and so forth. And I love being a bookseller. I still do. There's nothing like being able to deal with the very quick changing turnover of titles, to be able to recommend to people books that you think they might enjoy, to be able to meet authors and talk to authors. So although I sort of had vague formed plans after university to go into publishing, I went and worked in a bookshop and I enjoyed it so much that I stayed there. So I started off as a Christmas temp at Blackwell's Charing Cross Road, and I lasted 9.5 years, by the end of which I was the shop floor manager for that shop, which was a big one on the Charing Cross Road. And during that time I did a lot of stuff. I looked after all sorts of sections. I looked after the kids section. I looked always after science fiction and fantasy because I was clear that that was my space and everybody else could do whatever they wanted. But and I ran a lot of events. We used to go and sell books at things like Jewish Book Week, at things like Latitude Festival, at various other conventions and venues. I got seconded out of London a couple of times to go and run smaller stores, and then came back to the Charing Cross Road one. And I loved it, I really did. But in about 2010, I had reached the point where I couldn't really see where else there was for me to go within bookselling. Crossrail had come in, which had completely demolished our sales. Our sales dropped by almost 40% the moment Crossrail shut the top of Tottenham Court Road, because people wouldn't come down to us. And we'd always been competitive with Foyles opposite, and the big Borders on Charing Cross Road, which had just shut down, and there was a Waterstones which had shut down, and the writing seemed a bit on the wall, plus my partner was pregnant. And I just thought, this is probably the moment to get out of shift work. I want to be able to spend some time. But I say that now, that's sort of rewriting history of it. What actually happened was, the team at Gallant, who I had known well because I had seen them at events, I had seen them at parties, I had bought off their books, I had done signings with a lot of their authors. For a time, we had in the shop a print-on-demand machine called the Espresso, which I had run for a while, which basically you turned up with a file and we would print and bind your book in the shop. And Gallant had used that a couple of times when they really needed an urgent proof. So it was a team that I knew well, and we went down the pub, and Jo Fletcher, who was and remains a brilliant editor, she's still at the same company with us, now running her own imprint, Jo Fletcher Books, was leaving, and they were looking for a new, either editor or editorial assistant, and they sort of said, well, why don't you just think about applying? And I said, I don't think it's ridiculous, I've got no experience whatsoever. But the thing that tipped it for me was that I had started in, I think, 2006, maybe. I suddenly realised I hadn't written anything since I left university. And so I started to keep a blog, a live journal, dear God, that shows my age, of the books I was reading. Because part of the thing about being a bookseller, especially one in a central London shop, is people send you proof copies well in advance. So, even now, I was the first person to write a review of Anansi Boys by Neil Gaiman. And I was the first person to write a review of The Gone Away World by Nick Harkaway. Because I got these things and I read them quickly and I put them up there. And let's not overstate things. It was a live journal. I did not have a lot of engagement, but it showed I could think critically and write critically about books. And I think that was what made them say to me, well, you ought to give it a go. And I hummed and hawed, but all the things I've just said about my partner being pregnant, about wanting to get out of shift work, made me think, well, if I don't go for this job, at Gallant, who are, and I obviously after 10 years I'm very biased, but were still the leading genre publisher in a genre that I loved. I thought, well, if I don't go for this one, what else will I do? And I had the interviews and I met various people, and some of them were a bit suspicious of me because I had no publishing experience, but I did have obviously a lot of bookshop experience. Also, my partner was an author, so I had sort of that side of things. I understood what contracts were, I understood what agents were. I knew more about the industry than I think some people were expecting. And I was lucky enough to be offered the job as editor. So.
And how did you go from that initial starting work with them to where you are now?
We had a conversation when I started, when my boss at the time, Simon Spanton, who had hired me, said, as an editor, you're meant to look after other people's books. We will pass you, some of Joe Fletcher's authors, we'll pass you some of our authors, but you're not a commissioning editor. And I said, well, I completely understand that. But I sort of was quite enjoying myself, and so in the first, I bought my first, I commissioned my first book after 3 months, and my second after 4, which was slightly not what I was supposed to be doing, but I found books that I thought were really good, and they both, neither of them set the world alight, although they were both great and I stand by them, but they both made money, and that's sort of the point of it. But yeah, part of it is tenaciousness. Publishing does move around, but I am where I want to be. I was always sure that I wanted to work for Gladness. I could have taken jobs over the years, which I've been offered at other places, but they were always not quite as... No, I don't want to say that, that's not fair. They're great publishers, but they weren't where I wanted to be. I wanted to be at Gladness. And so I moved through, and the way things work is people leave, and you get more responsibility, and you often have to work at a higher level than you're being paid for your job title, but that's sadly the way things are. But the really turning point for me was when my much loved colleague Darren Nash, who was running the Science Fiction Masterworks list, and also the Science Fiction Gateway, which is our big ebook only classic science fiction. Thank you, Claire. Now editorial assistant at Gateway. But Darren made the decision after, he was from Australia, his wife was from Australia, they'd settled in London, and on a long haul flight he got a deep vein thrombosis, and they basically said, you can only do 2 more flights. So he decided, we have to go back to Australia to be with my family, to be with all this. And that gave me the opportunity to look after that list. And I had read the Science Fiction Masterworks. I remember buying the first ones in 2000 when Malcolm Edwards, my ex-boss, had set up the list, and it was curated by these wonderful authors, by Ian Banks and all sorts of people. And they were meant to be the classics of the genre. Now, it is entirely true and fair to say that they were the classics of the genre as defined by A, what Gladness could get the rights to in the year 2000, and B, what had won awards, what had been influential. So what it is, to be clear, especially those first ones, it is a bunch of white men from the 60s. But at the same time, when I first read those books in 1999-2000, before I was aware of the genre as a canon, it was just a series of amazing titles. And everyone I read and thought, that's interesting. Not always great, but interesting. So the chance to have an input into that and to curate that list was hugely important to me. Excuse me. And what Darren in his final years tried to do, and what I'm trying to do now, is to broaden the remit so that we have not just the books which won the Hugo and the Nebula, but also books which were important, which were missed, which were good, but perhaps didn't get the readership they deserved at the time. But through all that, I had my own authors. I built my own list. I took over authors from people who left. And for me, the joy is, and there's a lot of very admin-y stuff about being a publisher, and it is a lot about getting things through the process and getting things done on time, and it can feel a little bit like a mechanism. But for me, the joy is either when somebody sends a book to me and I start reading and I go, oh yeah, I can see how this would work. Or when an existing author sends their new novel in and I go, oh, actually great, I can't wait to read book 2 of X, or I can't wait to read the next thing. It's you have to work quite hard as a publisher to remind yourself that the best bit of the job, and the one that you generally do in the evenings and on your off time, is where you get to read books that no one else has read yet. And then you get to say, this is how you can make it a little bit better. Sorry, authors.
So when you have a book come across your desk that really excites you, what sort of thing is it that gets you really enthusiastic about work?
I mean, the answer to that question changes a bit. We have to be. This is the bad bit, the dull bit. We have to be realistic. We have to be hard-headed. We have to say, is this a book that I think we can sell enough copies of to make us some money? And we have to look at our existing list and say, does this fill a gap? Do we even have room for it? You know, there's a limit to how many books we can publish a year. But that's the technical stuff. What matters for me is, and I don't get it very often, but that's good because I can only publish 2 or 3 new books a year at most. So, is when I start reading and I look up half an hour, an hour later, and I go, oh, actually, hold on a second. This has really kept my attention because a lot of books, and this is personal taste, a lot of it, and you can't really account for that. Sometimes it is because they are not well written or they are not the genre that we publish. But for me, the moment when I start and even a few pages in, I go, actually, there's something here, and that keeps on working and it keeps on exciting me. I have to be really excited about a book to want to publish it because I don't get to publish very many, really. But for me, it's that moment when you start reading it and you go, I know exactly what this author is trying to do. They are achieving it. It is well written. It is interesting and not, you know, a clone of something we've already seen. And there's room for the very generic in its strictest sense genre. There's definitely a readership for that, and we publish some stuff like that. But for me, what is the moment where I go, actually, putting aside everything else, if I was a reader and I picked this up in the shop, I would want to keep on reading.
So,
the other thing, of course, though, the rather dull thing is, you have to be commercial about it. You have to think about what might sell. But the thing that really excites me is when I see something that isn't obviously commercial, it isn't obviously a definite thing I should buy, but I can see what is interesting about it that I know I can reach readership. And not every book will sell 1 million copies, and that's okay. But when I spot something which I know will find an audience, and as long as that audience is big enough, it doesn't have to be massive, but it has to be enough to make it worthwhile publishing the book, that I really like. Something that I sort of think actually other editors might not spot the thing that I think I have spotted, and sometimes I'm wrong and they don't reach their audience, and that's a shame and I hate it, but I love it when I spot something which I think is really interesting.
So, what is a book that you wish you had published?
Only in terms of things that I've seen, or can I sort of range wider?
As wide as you like.
So technically, very technically, I turned down The Martian, which, you know, in hindsight. But you know, I stand by that. It had been self-published, it was getting some traction, we spotted it doing well, and I took a look at it, and then it came through from the agent, and I'm afraid I just found it really dull. And I could see what it was doing, and it wasn't badly written, but it wasn't for me, which is weird because I am quite sort of hard SFing. And I confess I've not read the final professionally published version. I don't know what the editor did to it. I was not the right publisher for that book because I didn't get it. I didn't get why it was cutting through. And there's always that bit at the back of your head where you go, yeah, you know, it's got some traction, it's doing quite well, it's interesting, perhaps we should just go for it, and maybe I should have gone with that. But I stand by the fact that I would not have published it as well as the people who did buy it, because they had a vision for it and I didn't. It's always a mistake to buy something that you can't see, but you sort of think, oh, I can imagine how it would work. If I as the editor and publisher can't articulate what needs to be done with that book, then we're not going to do it well. And I'm not saying it would have vanished. Of course it wouldn't. It is a good book, and it already had a following. But I don't think we'd have done it as well as Del Rey did. So that's my sort of slightly commercial. Actually, obviously, maybe I should have done. But I don't know. There are so many books that I've gone for that I haven't got because another publisher has bid for them. There are books where I thought, actually, I really like this, but I haven't quite been able to. It's rare that I can't convince a publishing meeting that we ought to go for something, and that's frankly one of the benefits of being a bit more senior, is that they listen to you a bit more. But I don't regret any of them. I don't think I made the wrong decisions, because that would then be saying that if I picked that, I wouldn't have been able to publish a book I had published. And everything I have published that I have bought for myself, I have loved and I have thought was a good book. But of course, there are. There are lots of people here, and there are lots of people who might be here in a normal year who aren't here this year, who I would love to work with. But they all needed an editor to see the thing in that first book that made it work. On the other hand, one of the benefits of working on the back list as well as the front list is when I went into publishing, I had a very small list of books and or authors that I would be delighted to publish, and I took them all off within 6 years, which was ridiculous. So I got to republish Good Omens by Gaiman and Pratchett, because we had the hardback rights, we launched with the original hardback publisher, and over the years there had been a series of unfortunate events which led to the paperback text being corrupted. So there were errors in it, and then Transworld, who were the paperback publishers, I'm not blaming them at all, but they had hired someone to try and fix those, and they had brought in more errors. So I got to spend 2 or 3 afternoons sitting in a room with Neil and Rob Wilkins, who is Terry Pratchett's assistant, stroke, etc., going through almost line by line all the changes that had come. So we had the English original first edition, we had the American first edition where they had introduced some changes to explain English things to Americans, and then we had the combined version, which had been the paperback, which had then been corrupted, not massively, you could read it and it would be fine, but there were definitely things in there which were not what Neil and Terry had wanted. So that was great. I got through a bunch of Good Omens. There's a book called Riggy Walker by Russell Hoban, which is genuinely one of my favourite books ever. And I got to put that into the Science Fiction Masterworks as a hardback. And we got David Mitchell, not the comedian, the good writer, to do an introduction for it. We republished all of Michael Moorcock's stuff, which is great, because I love Michael Moorcock, but for me, his best novel is Mother London. And that book was massively influential on me when I first read it in 96, 95, and I got to republish that. We got to republish again in hardback because we had the old license, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And suddenly I was sitting there going, I've done Good Omens, I've done Hitchhikers, I've done Mother London, and I've done Riggy Walker. And that was the 4 books that meant probably the most to me, certainly within the genre. I mean, how can I not love doing that? We also, and it's not as important to me, those books, but we've got a beautiful new edition of Dune just due out any moment, obviously film, obviously blah, blah, blah. But again, also that, just being able to say, and to be fair, my colleague Brendan did all the work on it, but to be able to say, yeah, this is a beautiful, beautiful version of a seminal text. I love doing that.
So editors generally work behind the scenes and are often not particularly well known, but you are known for attending events and talking to people. So what's your favourite thing about being more accessible and being at events and things? What do you get out of that?
I mean, to be fair, I think there are a number of UK editors who do make the effort. I mean, Dave Moore is here, as he always is from Rebellion, and I think my colleague Gillian, when she's in the UK, is often at these things. I think you do see editors, and I think that's a slightly old-fashioned thing, where I think we do it because we've always done it. But I really enjoy it because, well, there are a number of reasons. I do think publishing is quite clubby and cliquey, and I like getting out and talking to people about it, because there are absolutely problems with it, and there are absolutely things that we should be better at. But also it's not as scary and walled in as I think some people think it is. And I like talking to people anyway. I especially like talking to people who are fans of the stuff I'm a fan of, so that makes life easier. But I do want to be able to be sitting in a bar and for someone to say, actually, I have got an idea for a book, actually I have approached an agent, I want to be able to either give that person advice or to get them to say, drop me a line. And there is no promise in that. There is no there's no massive benefit to them, but they can at least talk to me about it. And I will happily demystify the things about publishing if I can. But the other one is, frankly, I within Orion, which is the company that Gallant's is part of, I can talk to the team about this stuff. And there are people who are into it, our publicists, our marketers, fine. And I can talk to my partner and my kid about it, but actually I like coming and talking to people who really know the stuff. And if I just go, actually, I think Le Guin, blah, 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 or I think McCaffrey, blah, 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 people won't need me to explain what I'm talking about. I like that. But for me, because it's not work, this for me, although I am obviously representing my company to a certain extent, but I like talking to people about it. And I'm aware that we can look like we're sitting in a tower somewhere saying no to all of you. And I don't want us to be that. I want us to be more open, and I want us to talk to people. It's why we, although we haven't done it for a bit, obviously, blah, 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 COVID, it's why we put on things like our Gallant's Fest, because we want to talk to our readers. And I think you are talking about a very niche of the people who will actually turn up to a live event talking about this stuff, but they're still important. Actually, and that was one of the great things about the pandemic when we did Gallant. I think the great things about the pandemic. I mean, that's a dreadful thing to say. One of the few benefits, but we put on our Gallant's Fest thing online, and I think we've seen this across the publishing industry where events have moved online, and actually you suddenly go, we've got a lot of people who would not have come. And that's because we're London-centric. Of course we are, that's where we all work and live. It's because you've got to turn up physically, you might have to pay for it. Actually, it's much better to be able to put stuff out and just say, come and listen. Because we have great authors, we have great staff who will talk about how things work. I hope, and I'm very determined, that we will not go back to that thing where, as lovely as a Fantasycon is, as lovely as a Gallant's Fest is, we're streaming this. That's what we should be doing for everything.
Yeah. So, what do you wish more writers knew about the editing and publishing process when they first come into it?
We slightly covered this in the publishing panel this morning. It is a really slow process. None of us want it to be as slow as it is. There are really good reasons for why it is that slow. It's not going to change in the near future. This is different if you're doing ebook-only publishing. It's different if you're doing with a small press. It's different if you're publishing yourself. You can be much more nimble. You can be much more agile. You can do really interesting things. But we are tied in to Waterstones, who remain our second biggest customer. And Waterstones need to have a cover and a full description, and ideally a manuscript 6 months before publication, which means we need to have everything in line well before that. And this is why I say to people, look, we'll put out the announcement that we've acquired your book now, but you need to finish redrafting it, I need to edit it, you need to look at it again, we need to go to copy editor. All those things need to happen, and we have to have that all done 6 months before we publish it. So it is very slow. And that is absolutely a throwback to the way publishing was, frankly, not even that long ago, maybe 30 years ago, when it was all done not on computers. But the fact is that it's still where we are at the moment. And I think there are certain publishers who are brilliant at being nimble about that and doing it more quickly, and we can do it, but we can't do it for every book. And I've got a slate of 10 or 12 books a year, and I can't ram everything through in super quick times. We need to have leeway for things to go wrong, for people to deliver late, for artwork to be rejected. You've got to build in a reason for all those things to happen. I guess the other thing is, who's a prospective writer or a writer? Especially in genre, there isn't that much money in it. There certainly isn't for editors, I'll tell you that. We are not a mainstream genre, and there are books which break through, and there are authors who do brilliantly, and Brandon Sanderson is rolling in his piles of cash, and that's fine. But the people who I have met, and there aren't that many of them, but there are enough of them that it worries me a bit, who think that they'll get a book deal and that will be life-changing, and it just sort of isn't going to be, unless you have a 1 in a million hit. But even then, don't give up your day job when you get the first offer, because until you know that you've got it, and it does happen, and that's the lottery, right? That's the thing that we all dream of. It does happen that people publish their first book and it goes absolutely insane. It doesn't happen for most people. Also, that publishers are rapacious, but we're not that rapacious. We are all there to make things as reasonable as we can, and yes, Amazon pay more royalties, I understand that, but they don't put the effort in that we do, they don't have the infrastructure we do, they don't have the access to bookshops that we do. We put a lot of effort in, and a lot of books that we publish don't make us money, but the author has made a chunk of money up front, which is why we pay in advance, which is, for me, still one of the most important things about traditional publishing is we will give you money up front and we won't ask for it back. And if we then don't make that book work, that's where we lose money, not where you do. That's depressing. I apologise. On the other hand, it's great when you get published because you have a book and you can go and talk about it to people and you can come to panels and you can read from it and you can write another one really quickly.
So are there any innovations or new directions you would like to see coming about in publishing over the next few years?
It's a big question. So, I don't think... No, I'm definitely not allowed not to say this because I get to choose. So, we are, at Gallant, more specifically, the Gateway, which is our ebook classic side of things. We're doing a thing which we've been talking about for 10 years and which I wish we'd done before, but we are finally doing our own direct selling app. So you don't have to buy your books from Amazon or Apple, you can buy them direct from us. And it's genuinely quite a good app. It has all of our Gateway titles on it, it's very straightforward. We're never going to break Amazon's monopoly, of course we're not. And Amazon are, when viewed from a certain light, great, because they sell a lot of books. But they're also, it's clearly not healthy for us to be so reliant on one retailer. I think because we are a slightly niche list with an audience who is more invested in this stuff, I think we have a chance to make that work, where actually you download the Gateway app and then you can just buy all the books direct from us. The author gets more money, we get more money, Amazon doesn't get more money. I think that's really interesting. I think we also, as an industry, and this is happening, and it's happening in some places more than others, and it's happening more quickly in some areas than others, we need to be better about not being middle-class London. And I say that as, frankly, a very signed-up member of the middle-class London. But we have to be more open, and we have to be more active about going out, and staff, frankly, who are not the kind of people who can afford to do it. We don't offer unpaid internships anymore, everything's paid, but at the same time, the fact is, if you're working and publishing in an entry-level job in central London, you're paying central London rent, and you're not getting... So there is... I think that's the thing we are getting better at. So one of the things that Hachette, who are our parent company, have done, and I don't mean to sound like we're sort of, ooh, Hachette, but we've just opened up offices in a bunch of cities around the country. So Edinburgh, Glasgow, Bristol, Leeds, Newcastle, thank you, Claire. That's really important to me. That means now when we hire, we don't ever have to say to anybody, when are you going to move to London and start paying London rent? You can go to your nearest office, and the setup is entirely that whoever is in any of those offices is exactly the same level as anybody who's in London. I think that's really important. And I hope that, excuse me. And to be fair, clear, I have nothing to do with that being instigated. This is all above my level, but I agree with it entirely. What I hope that will lead to, and it might be a slow process, but I think it will help, is making it so that we get to hear more authorial voices who aren't London. And I think publishing is better at that than we sometimes tell ourselves that we are, because if a good book comes in, you don't look at where somebody's come from. But I think it's good to move the focus outside of the handful of offices on the Thames that we currently have.
And do you think that COVID and the work remotely will change the way that publishing jobs go forward? Will there be more option for people to work remotely and therefore from a wider variety of areas?
I think hope it will. I'm not entirely certain. I think when it all started and when we suddenly realised we were looking at a year of it, I think we all thought that was it, officers are dead. That's not true, and there are a lot of good reasons for that not to be true. And it is different being in a building with other people, and we've had a couple of people during that period who've not had a chance to get in the office, and I know it's been more difficult for them because they haven't been able to socialise with their peers, they haven't been able to just do that thing where you usually never go, I can't remember how to do this, can you? I think and I'm speaking only for Hachette here, not anybody else, I'm not speaking for Hachette, I'm speaking only in terms of Hachette, if we didn't have those regional offices, I think we would probably be a bit more casual about how much people had to come in. But now that there is probably somewhere you can get to, I do think it makes sense that, I don't think there needs to be a hard and fast rule, but actually you do get things from working with people, you do get things, especially in a creative business, from being able to just take 5 minutes to run. Yeah, I think it's really complicated, and I'm glad I don't have to make any decisions about it.
So, you have run 2 Kickstarter campaigns in the past. Can you tell us a bit about those?
So that was very much a side project. So hopefully everybody here know who Quentin Blake is?
Yeah.
Because of you.
Oh, that counts. So Quentin Blake is a fine artist. I'm most known for doing Roald Dahl's illustrations. But so there were a series of books published in the 60s which he illustrated. They were part of his first work. And they were by a Methodist minister called J.P. Martin, who told these stories to his kids and then his grandkids. And they kept on saying, you should put these into a book, you should put these into a book. And he sort of, And in the end, his daughter, who was a quite well-known playwright at the time, took them to her publisher, Jonathan Cape, and said, look, here are these stories my dad has typed up as Christmas messages for his grandchildren. Do you think there's anything in them? And they said, yeah, actually, we do. They got Quentin Blake to illustrate them. The first book came out 3 months, maybe 5 months before J.P. Martin died at the age of 89. But then there were 5 more, which they put together from all these stories he told these kids that he'd written down every year and sent them as Christmas letters. And I completely randomly found them in a junk shop when I was 8 or 9 or 10, and I loved them. And at some point, I got rid of them because they were kids' books and I didn't need them anymore. But I always remember loving them. And then when I was a bookseller, excuse me, the first one was republished by the New York Review of Books as a classic. And people would come in and ask all the time, I mean, genuinely, 2 or 3 times a month, somebody new would come in and say, where can I get the rest of them? There are 6, here is 1, why haven't you got the rest? And it was completely impossible to buy a set because they had very small print runs and they were going for genuinely thousands of pounds sometimes because there was a fan base for them. And over the years I knew that, for example, Neil Gaiman, Garth Nix, Will Self, Kate Summerscale, all these people, I knew they were fans, but nobody could understand why Random House, who controlled the rights, wouldn't reprint these books. And the answer was because they didn't want to spend £1,000 to buy a copy to scan to put out as an ebook. But I got annoyed by it, and then I went into publishing, and I'd been a bookseller for years, I'd been a publisher for a few years, so I knew how to put a book together. An ex-friend of mine, no, that's not fair at all. They were still a friend of mine, but it was somebody who I hadn't seen for a bit, went and got a job at Random House Children's Books, and I dropped her a line and I said, can you just look and see what is going on with the rights to these books, because I really want something to happen. And she got back to me and she said, well, they're there, but we can't do them. So I said, here's my proposal, here is how I know I can make this work. Can I sub-license the rights for you to republish all these books in one volume with new introductions by Neil and Garth and Kate and Will Self and all these people. And they sort of, I think they were a bit, Kickstarter hadn't launched in the UK, but I knew it was going to in a couple of months' time. So they were completely bemused, they didn't understand that. I said, but I know it's launching, I want to be set up so we can be there almost on the week that it launches in the UK. And I love Kickstarter as a mechanism. I think it absolutely can bring audiences to books that, well, everything, but books especially that they wouldn't. so I got in touch. It took a lot of organisation. I got in touch with all the famous people I knew who liked it, who would write me an introduction. I got hold of all the books because the family still had copies, which I could borrow and very carefully scan. And I put it on Kickstarter, and it was genuinely lovely. I got a very stern talking to from my boss, because there's something in my contract which says I'm not allowed to publish outside of shares. And I said, but I asked you about it, and you said it was okay. And they said, I don't remember that. I said, no, I definitely did. I would have checked, I definitely checked. Here's the email. And they went, oh shit. Well, go on then. But they were very much like, you have to pull the plug. But I showed them the email where they'd say, yeah, you can do this. And it went really, really well. And we met our target within an hour of launching, because there was this huge pent-up demand for these books. And this is part of what feeds into my masterwork thing and the Gateway thing. There are books out there which people really want to read again, which haven't made it through the digital divide. And sometimes you just need somebody who is enthusiastic and knows what they're doing to bring them out again.
On that note, do you see yourself doing any more campaigns like that?
They are awfully tiring. There's a lot to organise. I made a very small amount of money out of it, and if you factored in the time I spent on it, I absolutely did not make any money out of it. But genuinely, it is one of the things I am proudest of, and I still meet people who say, I backed your Kickstarter, I read those books as a kid and I had no opportunity to get them again. It's genuinely one of the best things I've ever done. I don't know, I would have to find absolutely the right book, and I don't think there's anything else out there that I have that personal connection with.
Zoids.
If I could find a way to reprint the short-lived 1984 Marvel comic based on the Zoids toys, I would, but nobody knows what the rights are. So if I can find out what the rights are, I'll do that. Yes, I agree. I'm the only person who cares about them, but I don't care. I reckon I could find... You'd only need a couple of hundred people to put some money. They were Grant Morrison's first work. There's got to be an audience for them. Anyway, one day.
I think we'll open up to audience questions now, if anyone has got... Thank you.
Hello, Gavin.
So, I wanted to ask, over your years as an editor, who was your favourite author to work with, and who was the worst author to work with, and are they both sitting at this table? Unfair at all? So, what I'll ask is, with your work with in Kickstarter and the master books, you've used the word curation a number of times. If you had a gun to your head, curation versus editing, which one do you enjoy most?
Oh, that's very interesting. I think, as much as I love looking for forgotten books and looking for books which deserve to have a new life and curating a list of tactics, if you were asking that question 25 years ago when the list was just getting started, I think I would choose curation. But now we're at a point when most things have been done, whereas I have this, there's a wide vista of new books and new authors who I can work with. So I think it has to be editing. I love looking after that list, and I love looking for interesting books that have been forgotten about. But too much of the low-hanging fruit has been picked. It has to be editing, because I think there are so many people I would like to work with who are already existing authors, and there are so many people who I would love to work with who haven't, yet come across my radar, or haven't yet finished their book. But I know that if you ask me in 5 or 10 years, those will be the people I'm more excited about. Again, if I hadn't managed to tick off those Mother London, Riggy Walker stuff off my list, maybe that would be different. But now I think I'm really looking forward to looking for new voices. Anyone else?
I did a little bit of research earlier and discovered that of all the guest-of-honours we've had since 2013, you are the only one without a Wikipedia page. So, my question is, you can design your own Wikipedia page, put what you like on it, would you like listed under your achievements?
God, I'm quite happy not having a Wikipedia page.
You do know that there's quite a few editors who do that in this room, yes?
No. The thing is for me, so what I definitely wouldn't want is anything particularly personal. There are a couple of things that I've achieved which would be fine. So this year Gallant's won Imprint of the Year at the British Book Awards. That's a massive thing. A genre imprint has never won that before. You know, I've judged a couple of relatively small prizes, maybe. But for me, the important thing is the books I've published. I'm resigned to the fact that at this point, Andrzej Sapkowski is going to be the most well-known because The Witcher is The Witcher. But actually, no, it's publishing Mike Harrison's The Second Time Begins to Rise Again, which won the Goldsmiths Prize, which again, a genre book has never won. It's about the authors who I have found who have not necessarily won awards even, but have found audiences. But I can't imagine that the Wikipedia page for most editors is publish these books. No, I think the Kickstarter stuff will be what I'm remembered for most. I think it's the Quentin Blake stuff. But I'm also entirely happy not being on there. Did you have one as well?
I have two.
Yeah?
Actually. I'm so sorry.
I think we're fine.
So I've typed them down just in case. So what's the difference between personal taste rather than professional taste? How do you differentiate between the two?
Is that question one?
Yeah.
You have to buy Tom. Love you.
Extra thinking time.
Okay, so there are definitely variations to answer that question. In the end, it has to come down to personal taste. Like I said earlier, if I don't like a book, I'm not going to be able to publish it effectively, no matter how much I can see its potential. And that's the thing where I think, as fiction publishers, we get a lot more leeway. Because I think if you were, for example, a cookbook publisher, you couldn't just say, I'm not going to buy the next Jamie Oliver because I don't quite like it enough. You would absolutely have to. But I have to always be aware that my personal taste has to inform what I'm buying, but isn't the be-all and end-all. And there are definitely moments when I have to question myself and say, am I enjoying this for me, but can I imagine other people really enjoying it, or is it just too niche? And there's nothing wrong with a book which I love and which 500 other people would love, but that's not something I can particularly publish. It's partly why before we acquire stuff, we generally circulate it around the Glance team to get a second view on stuff.
Okay. Yeah.
And if an editor is absolutely sold on it, then fine. I'm never going to stand in their way. But this is again is where the split between being the editor, whether that's me or someone else, and then being the publisher, the publishing director comes. You have to look at it commercially and say, will it make money, or do we think it will? Will it fit in with our list? But also, I guess you just have to double check yourself and say, I know I like this, but am I caught up in it? Am I caught up in it because I finally found a book that really, really works for me? You've got to have a commercial head on. And frankly, if you don't, you'll go into a meeting where the sales team, the marketing team, the publicity team, all those people will say, but explain to us why this book is the one that you need to publish above anything else. And if you can't answer that question well, then you don't deserve to get it published. You need to be able to convince them. So if you can't convince your colleagues who you work with every day, how on earth are you going to convince the readership? If that makes sense.
Yeah, okay, so
But it is, to be fair, it is the eternal dilemma, because you find a book you love and sometimes you have to go, I love it, but I don't think this is the right moment. And that's part of the really sad thing about submissions, is the books will come in, which if they come in 6 months before or 6 months after, perhaps I would have gone for. But if I've just bought a book in that area, I have to say, I don't have room for another one like this.
And And so then my second question is, how much do you read? Like, how much do you read before you decide that it's not the right book for you? Do you read, I'm guessing you don't read the whole book before you decide? What do you do? What's the process?
That slightly changes depending on where it's come from. But no, obviously every book that I have bought I have read the whole of, but I don't read the whole of every book. There's no possible time. I think it's fair to say if it comes from an agent who I know and respect, or if it comes from a colleague who's saying, can you take a look at this, I will read further so I can give a better opinion. Of course there are books where I read, frankly, 10, 15 pages and I go, this isn't for me. Generally that's not because it's badly written, although sometimes that, of course, does happen. But we can, you can work on the prose, you can work on... But if it hasn't grabbed me in the first 50 pages, unless there's been something amazing in the submission letter, I find it hard to see how I can then make that book work. And I know that's unfair, because frankly, some of my favourite books ever don't grab me in the first 50 pages. And that's absolutely a problem. One of my examples of this is Dragonbone Chair by Tad Williams, which doesn't do anything, basically 200 pages. But I love beyond measure. And if that had come into me as a submission, I probably would have said no to it. And that is something that, I'm not sure, say quite keeps me up at night, but it certainly worries me. The trouble is, there are a lot of books out there, and if something, it doesn't have to grab me with a hook, it doesn't have to grab me with an exciting scene, but if I'm not enjoying the writing enough, then it's probably not right for me.
Thank you.
I know it's bleak. On the other hand, when I get a book, whether it's from an agent or from a slush pile or whatever, there is nothing like the feeling when you go, I try not to read synopses before I start reading a book. I don't want to know what's going to happen. I want to... This is going to sound immensely wanky, and I apologize for it. If there was a Marcus Gipps theory of reading, it's that most people only read a book once. So when I'm editing, and when I'm reading a book on submission, it's not, do you pay this off down the line? It's that if I picked this up and I was just reading 50 pages as a reader in a bookshop, would it keep me going? Because people don't reread books to any great extent. The most important read is the first time. So if it's not convincing me on the first read, then it's probably not right for me.
Thank you.
Do we have any others?
I have a follow-up question on that, because it's interesting the way that you describe that. It sounds very common sense. You read it, you either like it or you don't. You either put it down or you keep reading. Is that universal within the industry?
I don't think so, and this is one of the things about publishing is it is still very, it's about individual taste, and editors and publishers, we all work our own way. I mean, I edit, for example, if we're talking about a book that I've acquired that I'm editing for publication, I edit in a very different way to my colleagues Julian or Rachel. We all have different methods. And I wouldn't for a moment say that any of them are right or wrong. I don't know, I do think, a lot of books get published across everything. I mean, within genre it's quite a small number, but actually we are a big industry and we publish a lot and there's room for a lot of different ways of working. And I think it would be to the detriment of the industry if we all had some sort of defined way of working out what to do. The really interesting ones for me, though, are the ones where I'm enjoying it, but I don't think it's quite right, but I can see what I would do to fix it. Those are the ones, and that's arrogant to say I can fix it, but to fix it for my pleasure. Those are the ones that take the longest time for me, where I'm reading it and I'm going, yeah, there's almost here, there's something here, if I just did this, maybe it would work. Those are the ones that I keep on reading, because that is also my job. My job is to work with a writer and make the book, at least in my opinion, better. They won't always agree. So in a funny way, almost those are more fun and challenging than the ones where I just read and go, yeah, it's great, let's publish it. All the ones where I read, this isn't right for me, let's get rid of it. It's the ones in the middle which take up more time.
I think we've got time for one more question if there are any more. Nope. Okay, well, thank you very much for speaking to us.
Well, thank you, Shona, for interviewing me. Thank you all for coming. This is significantly more people than I expected. Only one of whom technically came.
Going for a run.
Okay, so thank you everyone, and thank you Marcus.
Thank you. Isn't it nice to be back at Fantasycon and doing things again? Have a lovely evening all.